Okay, Wally, whenever you're ready.
Okay, good morning, good Erev Shabbos. We're going to try to finish up the other story of Hanukkah. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about. If you haven't yet gone out and gotten your copy of Josephus or the books of the Maccabees, I could also refer you, if you have the Birnbaum Siddur. Included in the Birnbaum Siddur, for some reason, is a little collection of stories called Megillas Antiochus, or Megillas Chashmonaim. It's included in the Birnbaum Siddur. It's a medieval work which combines stories from the book of Maccabees and Josephus and Midrashim, and it's actually read in certain. It used to be read anyway in Rome and in the Yemenite communities. I don't know what the two have in connection, but that's where they used to read Megillas Antiochus on Hanukkah. In any event, let's try to fast forward the battles between the Chashmonaim and the other religious Jews who left Jerusalem. They abandoned Jerusalem because it became a pagan temple, even though the Kohanim was still there. And as I said, it was a civil war between traditionalists and assimilationists. And that was the main crux of the battle. And of course, the Syrian Greeks under Antiochus IV joined in the fray because he wanted to show that he could control Jerusalem and the Jews in it. A lot of stories about a lot of battles, very graphic. One of Matisyahu's sons, Elazar, was actually squashed by an elephant during one of the battles. Interesting halachos came out of it. At one point, a lot of the Chashmonaim were hiding in a cave on Shabbos. And they found out that the Jews were there, and they set fire to the cave, and the smoke killed a lot of people that were in there. And based on that episode, the halacha developed that you can fight back on Shabbos if your lives are at stake, which is a very important halacha, which until that time was not necessarily in force. And a lot of them, rather than fight on Shabbos, they died in that conflagration. In any event, let me retell the story a little bit differently than what you heard. And this is based on a sefer called Midrash Psikta Rabasi. It's composed in Eretz Yisrael, a set of Midrashim. Perhaps a little bit later than the Gemara, but it's an Israeli Midrash. And Sefer Chashmonaim and other sources that tell us that the battle was basically a guerrilla warfare. They were fewer in number than the Syrian Greeks that joined forces to conquer the Jews. A lot of terrible battles. And towards the end, the Jews were victorious. They managed to kick out of Jerusalem the assimilationists as well as the Greeks. So the last major battle was won. And you have the Syrian Greeks guarding the Beis Hamikdash. This was, I guess, their last stand. And if you can picture the throng of Jews coming up Harabayas, approaching the Harabayas. And there were 8 guards on duty at that time. And they saw the throng of Jews coming up the hill. They dropped their spears and they retreated. When they get to Harabayas, this is reminiscent of the 6-Day War, when the Israeli soldiers cut up to the Harabayas, so they said, Hakotel biyadenu, Hakotel biyadenu, if you remember, those that can remember that. So they took the spears that the Syrian Greeks had dropped, and they lopped off the top, the spear part, and they made victory torches out of those spears, and they waved them to say, Hakotel biyadei. The Beis HaMikdash is now ours. And they reclaimed the Beis HaMikdash. And then began the process of cleaning it up. There was a sorega, there was a lattice work that they used for different types of prostitution in the Beis HaMikdash, and there was all kinds of schmutz. Everything was sullied and desanctified, if I can use the word. They couldn't use anything in the Beis HaMikdash. So a cleanup process began. And if you look in Megillah Santi, in the Sefer Hashmonaim, so it talks about them coming up, and then he appointed Yehuda Maccabi, Yehuda Hashmonai actually appointed unblemished priests, lovers of Torah, who purified the sanctuary, removed the stones of the loathsome structure to an unclean place. Now, what do they do with all the things that they had to get rid of? At one time, they dismantle them, but what do you do with them? Can you kosher them, so to speak? So they put them all. They hid it someplace until a Navi would come and tell them what to do with it, because these were the shulchan and the mizbeah, all the stones. And then they built a new altar after the pattern of the old. They repaired the sanctuary, sanctified the interior of the house and the courts, made new sacred vessels, altar of incense, etc., etc., etc. So my question to you, how long did this process take? Did they enter the Beis HaMikdash and all of a sudden, temple as usual? You don't clean up a defiled Beis HaMikdash overnight. Most of the stories about Hanukkah, it would seem that on the 25th of Kislev, they came up, they retook the temple, and all of a sudden, poof, the Beis HaMikdash is back in shape again. So, little background. Number one, the temple was desecrated on the 25th of Kislev in the year 167 BCE. When they regained the Beis HaMikdash 2 years later, two things took place. Number one, they waited to rededicate the Beis HaMikdash until Chaf Hei Kislev to show the exact date that it was defiled. It is now sanctified or re-sanctified. Hanukkah means rededication, not dedication, rededication. Because when they dedicated the Beis HaMikdash, Shlomo Melech celebrated it for 7 days. When they built the Mishkan in the Midbar, Moshe celebrated it for 7 days. However, if you look in Tanakh, when in an early generation, the Babylonians tried to destroy the Beis HaMikdash before it was ultimately destroyed, and they rededicated the Beis HaMikdash after they cleaned it up, that rededication was 8 days long. So there is precedent for an 8-day rededication. Hanukkah is a rededication. But going back to my basic question, how long did it take them to clean up the Beis HaMikdash? So we go back to that Sefer, Megillas Tanis. Megillas Tanis tells us that on the 23rd day of Cheshvan, they began cleaning up the Beis HaMikdash. So in essence, a month before we celebrate Hanukkah is when they entered Harabayas and when they were able to clean up the Beis HaMikdash. It took them a month, which makes sense. Now, what happened to those 8 spears? What the Gemara calls a Shmona Shpudim Shel Barzel. So Midrash Psikta Rabasi, very important Midrash, tells us that they took those 8 spears that they made the victory torches out of, and those 8 spears became the new menorah. Later on, they covered it with tin and then silver and eventually gold, but the first menorah of the new rededicated Beis HaMikdash was made from those 8 spears. The number 8 is very important because the question is always asked, why is Hanukkah 8 days long? The Gemara asks us, my Hanukkah. Why do we celebrate Hanukkah? And they talk about the Pach Shemen, which was a later addition. Don't know where it came from. The rabbis threw it in there. There's a whole book. There's a sefer called Ner Lameya, which gives you 100 reasons why Hanukkah had to be 8 days long. About 20 years ago in Israel, another book came out with 500 reasons, mostly drush. But the point is, there are many, many reasons. Reason number 1 I just gave you. The 8 spears that formed the first menorah, as quoted in Midrash Psikta Rabbasi, is the reason given for 8 days of Hanukkah. 8 spears. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 for 8 days. They occupied the Beis HaMikdash in Cheshvan, which is right after Tishrei. They could not celebrate Sukkot because they were fighting in the mountains outside Jerusalem. When they regained the Beis HaMikdash and re-sanctified it, they did a tashlumin, a makeup of Sukkot, which is 8 days long. And Sefer Chashmonaim tells us that they celebrated a month later, or 2 months later, as the case may be. They celebrated Sukkot with lulavim and esrogim and Hallel, which we say on Hanukkah, for 8 days. So you have the Shmona Shmudim Shel Barzel, and you have the 8 days of Sukkot. Those are the 2 most important reasons why Hanukkah is 8 days long. Other reasons given. The place where they got pure olive oil was a place called Motzah, which was 4 days away from Jerusalem. 4 days there, 4 days coming back, 8 days. Who was fighting in the battle? Mostly Kohanim, religious Kohanim. Well, if you came in contact with a corpse, what do you have to do? You have to wait a week and then go to mikveh. 8 days. Many, many important reasons for 8 days. The Gemara, by the way, in 3 different places, makes reference to the Shmona Shmudim Shel Barzel, but somehow or other, people who study Talmud never made the connection. I don't know why. The Gemara says, you may not make anything like the Kalim in the Beis HaMikdash. You can't you're not allowed to imitate them, and you can't make a menorah of 7 branches, because that was, and they referenced the Shmona Shmudim Shel Barzel, which was the first menorah of the Chashmonaim. That's number 1. I mean, 2 or 3. There are so many other reasons. The Simchas Beis HaShoeva, interestingly. Now, here's an interesting drush. The Simchas Beis HaShoeva, which takes place every night of Sukkot, during Chol HaMoed, people are up all night long. A fellow I know, Michael Wolf, suggested that people were staying awake all night long to see if the oil would last, which is an interesting take on that particular story. There are so many reasons why Hanukkah had to be 8 days long. The people who talk about the oil lasting for 8 days raise the basic question. The Beis Yosef, author of the Shulchan Aruch, has a very famous kasha. If there was enough oil to last 1 day, then the miracle was only 7 days long. So why do we celebrate for 8 days? He asks the question. And as I said, there are hundreds of answers. I gave you a few. Among the suggestions, you had people say that, well, they cut the wick into eighths. So it will be a tiny, tiny flame and it would last longer. Or they divided the oil into eighths.
Rabbi?
Lasted. There are many, many different, as I say, there are literally hundreds of answers to the debate. But the fact that he raises the question, indicates that there are issues with the story of the Pach Shemen. Now, yes.
Question. Could, yes, they found the Pach Shemen, so that was one day. So the nest was Batsem 7 days. But couldn't it also be that since the Beit HaMikdash was so defiled and destroyed, the very fact that they could even find one Pach Shemen was in itself perhaps a nest, and that's why it's 8. Maybe, I don't know.
Why 8 then? If the fact that they found it, all right, so 7 plus 1. As I said, there are literally hundreds of answers to the Beis Yosef's question. But there's a more basic question. First of all, why is there no real discussion of Hanukkah in Talmud? There's no Mishnah. There is not a single Mishnah that deals with Hanukkah. You have one line in the Gemara. My Hanukkah, the Gemara says, why do we say Hallel on Hanukkah? And they quote the first part of Megillas Tanis. They say, during Hanukkah is 8 days long, no hespedim and no fasting. That's Megillas Tanis. Then they add the line about the Pach Shemen. So why was it added? Why was there no story? There are a number of interesting. Yehuda Hanassi, who compiled the Mishnah, obviously was opposed to the Tzedukim, who denied the validity of Torah Shebaal Peh. And the Tzedukim came, unfortunately, 2 or 3 generations later from the Chashmonaim. And to reflect the fact that they were Tzedukim, he leaves out everything about Hanukkah. They didn't want to talk about it. Purim, you have a Masechta, you have Mishnayos, you have Halachos. Nothing about Hanukkah. No Mishnah about Hanukkah. A little bit of Halacha about lighting it, and Pesumei Nisa, and so forth and so on. But how is Hanukkah celebrated? So, in all probability, now Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, calls it Chag HaUrim, the Festival of Lights. And one of the reasons why, because every year, Josephus supports this and others, every year after the temple was rededicated, they used to have torchlight parades in Jerusalem with lulavim and esrogim for 8 days. Torchlight parades, lulavim, esrogim, to remember that the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot. The first Hanukkah was a tashlumin, a makeup for the Sukkot that they couldn't observe. So in following generations, they would have the torches from the Shmona Shmudim Shel Barzel, which they waved on top of the Har HaBayis, and esrogim and lulavim. Remember that, to remember what it came from. We have forgotten that Hanukkah was originally celebrated like Sukkot. So what happened to those torchlight parades? In between the Greeks and the Romans, who controlled Jerusalem, for a short period of time, the Persians controlled Jerusalem, and the Persians were Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrians worship the god of fire. And the winter solstice occurs roughly around the period of time that Hanukkah occurs. And when they would have their celebration, the only place that fire was allowed to burn publicly was in their temple. So Jews were not allowed to have torchlight parades anymore. What happened? From torchlight parades, where Hanukkah was a public celebration, it now became a private home celebration, and that's where the menorah was born. That's where the Chanukiah came from. They couldn't have it in public, so they had it in their homes. And then goes a whole discussion, where do you put the menorah and how do you light the candles and so forth. The fact that 400 years after the event, they were still arguing about how do you light the menorah, which meant it wasn't fixed yet. Some were following Beis Hillel, some were following Beis Shammai. And by the way, look in the Gemara, Shabbos Chaf Aleph. They talk about lighting the menorah, ascending order or descending order. And, how many days are left? How many days have passed by? Beis Hillel says, Malin b'kodesh ve'ein moridim. The nace was increased each day, so we go up and fine. What is Beis Shammai? Beis Shammai says you light in descending order. And you get a very strange reason. And unless you heard my lecture or read Sefer Chashmonoim and Josephus, you wouldn't understand Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says we light the candles in descending order, keneged porei hachag, just like the Sukkot sacrifices. The Sukkot sacrifices were offered in descending order. The first day they were 14, 13, 12, 11. They were in descending order. So he acknowledges the fact that there's a connection between Hanukkah and Sukkot. And unless you know the backstory, you wouldn't understand Beis Shammai's reasoning. Why he says Keneged Porei Hachag. And Rashi, by the way, makes reference to the fact that when there's persecution, that's where the menorah becomes lit inside. And you don't have to put it in the window because Pesume Nisa could get you in trouble. There's a whole discussion there in the Gemara. But they're still arguing in the 4th century what took place in the 1st century or BCE, because it hadn't been fixed yet. There were many different ways. And the parades they used to have, the public parades, had to come a private celebration. And how many candles you have to light? One candle, and then the whole machlokas in terms of how many menorahs you have to, how many candles you have to light, and so forth and so on. Josephus refers to it as the Festival of Lights because Jerusalem was lit up with all these torchlight parades. There's a lot of other Greek sources that kind of support this as well. But again, to summarize, the Shmona Shpudim Shel Barzel is mentioned in Psikta Rabasi. Shabbos says it's because of the Pach Shemen. Nobody raises the question, which is it? The 8 spears? Forget about the Sukkot connection, but the 8 spears or the Pach Shemen? Which is the real reason? I've only found one source. Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, Maritz Chayes, was a 19th century Galiciana Godel, great Godel. In every standard edition of Shas, there are certain commentaries that are included. The Rosh, the Rif. In every standard edition of the Shas, the Maritz Chayes commentary is there. It's printed in the Shas. So he raises the question, which is it? Is it the 8? And he read Psikta Rabasi, as I'm sure others may have, but didn't make the connection. Is it the 8 spears or the Pach Shemen? So his suggestion, and is the only person that there may be other, but I haven't seen any others, and I can't say that I know everything, but I haven't seen any other source. So he says the miracle of the Pach Shemen took place in those 8 spears, which became the first menorah. And that's how he kind of puts the two together. He's the only person that deals with the question. The bottom line is there are many, many, many reasons why Hanukkah has to be 8 days long. Main reason is a connection to Sukkot. Then the 8 spears. These are historical reasons. The Pach Shemen was added by the rabbis, in all probability, because they didn't want to celebrate a military victory without God's intervention. So you add the miracle story into it, and it gives it a more, as Rabbi Riskin would say, it kedoshifies the story a bit. Anyhow.
Wally,
Yes.
why do they say it was without God's intervention? How do they know God didn't intervene with some type of miracle that we don't even understand?
Look, the fact that because the military victory itself was God's hand, for sure. The fact that a ragtag bunch of rabbis and traditional Jews without military training could defeat the Syrian Greek army that was fighting alongside the Hellenists was itself a miracle. You know, the same way that the ragtag army in 1948 defeated all the other Arab armies. They weren't a trained army. They didn't have soldiers that were trained.
That was definitely a miracle.
So it was definitely miraculous that they were able to overcome the Syrian Greeks.
So why did they say
Because
that it was not
again,
a miracle?
I cannot speak on behalf of the Chachamim. I can only tell you what Megillas Tanis says. Megillas Tanis just says it's 8 days long, no fasting, no hespedim. The rabbis added the story of the Pach Shemen. It lasted for 8 days. I have given you a number of other reasons why Hanukkah had to be 8 days. Most prominently, the fact, again, the 8 spears that they found, which became the very first menorah, which is referred to, and the Gemara talks about it in 3 different places, that those 8 spears became the very first menorah. Oh, by the way, last thing I wanted to say, talk about the 8 spears. In recent years, during the life of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he had a big campaign about lighting public Hanukkah menorahs. What is the shape of the Lubavitch menorahs that you see in public squares all over the world now? Are they round?
Nope.
Or are they straight? Those are the 8 spears. There's a machlokas, Rashi and Tosfos. What did the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash look like? Did it look like those big Chabad menorahs, which are straight, or were they curved? So obviously Chabad holds, like the Rambam, that they were like the Shmona Shvudim Shel Barzel, like 8 straight spears. Now it's interesting, if you go to Rome, next time you're in Rome, stop by the Arch of Titus. There was a practice that after major military victories, they would build an arch commemorating the victory. So Titus, who was the general and then the emperor when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, so they built the Arch of Titus. And the inside of the arch, there's what they call a frieze, a carving inside the Arch of Titus, which shows the Jews being taken to Rome as slaves. And it shows certain Klei HaMikdash, the trumpets and the shulchan, and there's a small menorah. Now, obviously, that menorah was not the one in the Beis HaMikdash, as people sometimes erroneously think, because the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash couldn't be carried by one person in his hand. It was a very tall structure. But that menorah, which was probably used like we use lamps on our desk tables, that was the illumination. That was a small menorah, and it was curved. So based on that curvature, that's how they think the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash looked. But I think there's very strong support for the Chabad version of what the menorah looked like, because the spears, straight spears, and the Gemara says those 8 spears were eventually covered after tin and silver, ultimately gold, and that became the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash. And in all probability, not like the ones that we used to seeing, the symbol of the state of Israel and so forth, but it was probably straight. Anyhow, any questions, comments, critiques on some of the backstory of Hanukkah?
Wally,
Yeah.
how could they use spears to make the menorah? You weren't allowed to bring iron into the Beis HaMikdash.
Okay.
You couldn't even use iron.
Good question. Okay, so the prohibition of iron in terms of building the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. You can't, and that's why they use the shamir to cut the blocks to build the stone walls of the Beis Hamikdash. But it's a good question. It's a very good question. But those 8 spears represented the victory of Torah over Hellenism. And again, it's a good question, but obviously the Chachamim at the time felt that it was important as a symbol of their victory. But the prohibition of using iron is only to cut the stones of the Beis Hamikdash. That's why you had this shamir worm that actually ate through the stones to make the blocks. But it's a good question. But it only refers to the stones, not necessarily to the menorah. But it's a very good question. It's a very good question. But the Gemara substantiates the fact that the very first menorah was made from those spears in the rededicated Beis Hamikdash.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to get into this, but since you mentioned the Chabad Hanukkah menorahs and everything, do you have a thought, one way or another, regarding all of this, putting Chanukiot out like in front of municipal buildings along with all the Christmas stuff and maybe Kwanzaa stuff? I know that there's a lot of opposition to it. You know, it's sort of like making Christmas and Hanukkah, you know, on the same plane or something like that. If you don't want to discuss it, you don't have to.
No, I think it's part of Persume Nisa. I think it's part. I mean, there's a halacha. If you're walking in the street and you see a menorah, you should make a bracha. Shasa Nisim, Shechayanu, the first night, because one of the again, originally we're talking about the commemoration of the victory, and again, the rabbis were loath to celebrate a military victory as opposed to a miracle-related victory, and as a result, when the menorah was developed as a concept, so attached to it was the concept of Persume Nisa, publicizing the miracle of the oil. So putting a menorah in the window, putting it in town square is obviously the Lubavitcher Rebbe felt that this was a kiyum of Persume Nisa to show the world about, you know, God's miracles and so forth and so on. But I personally have no objection to it. I don't know if I'd advocate for it, but I certainly have no objection for it. I do remember that when Rabbi Newbort first came to town, so he tried to have a menorah put up at the Fairlawn Library next to the creche. I don't believe he succeeded, and even today, I don't believe there's a menorah in front of Town Hall in Fairlawn. But he had somebody, I believe, who lives across the street from Town Hall, and a big menorah on their lawn. But I think it's a mistake for the town not to have a menorah there, or a Kwanzaa, whatever they want to do. But if you're putting up a holiday, what do I want to call it? Symbols, it should be for all the holidays of all the citizens of Fairlawn. So
there's a big Hanukkah at the train station.
Yes, but that's Chabad.
Right.
That's Chabad. And then you have there's a gas station on the corner of Fairlawn Avenue. They used to have a big menorah. Not Fairlawn Avenue, Moreland Avenue and Plaza Road. They used to have a big menorah. But a lot of places, and they're all over there. The George Washington Bridge has it. The airports have it. Chabad is very effective in getting these menorahs put up all around town. Somehow Town Hall is still resisting that. I'm not quite sure why. But I see no problem in having menorahs in the public square because that's part of Persume Nisa.
Thank you.
Wally?
Yeah.
I understand there used to be a sign on Moreland Avenue when you crossed the bridge from Patterson that said, "Welcome to Fairlawn, a Christian community." So that could explain it.
Well, it's certainly, I remember the Radburn Association was the first association of its type in America. It was 1920s. The Radburn Association was built with the sole purpose that no child should have to cross the street to go to school. And it's an incorporated village within Fairlawn. And there were no Jews allowed in Radburn. Now that changed in I would say in the 50s and 60s. They first began allowing Jews. And I remember in the early 1970s, I used to play tennis with a friend of mine who lived in the apartment building in Radburn. And I would wear a hat. He would defiantly wear his yarmulke because there were a couple of old anti-Semites who were playing tennis in the next court, and he wanted to stick it to them. But Radburn was originally no Jews allowed. Tuxedo Park, New York, no Jews were allowed in there either. There were a lot of communities like that, and I don't doubt for a moment that sign existed. But that has changed. Okay, have a wonderful Shabbos and a Hanukkah Sameach.
Careful walking in the snow.
It won't be that much, I don't think.
Let's hope.
It's just going to be cold.
Good Shabbos. Thank you. Thank you, Wally.
Have a good
Have a
Shabbos.
fantastic Shabbos.
Thank you, Wally. Have a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, all.
Good Shabbos, everybody.
Shabbos.